All right, I think we'll get started now. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Lucy Handley. I do adult programs at the Ridgefield Library. And this morning, I'm very pleased to host Kitsy Snow of the Ridgefield Garden Club, who will introduce our presenters. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Lucy. Welcome, and thank you for joining the Ridgefield Garden Club's annual conservation meeting. I want to thank the Ridgefield Library for hosting our event today, and to thank our speakers, Sefra Alexandra, Dina Brewster, and Jean Linville, and also the supporters of the talk today, the Ecotype Project, the Hickories, CT NOFA, and both the Ridgefield Garden Club and Kautatoa Garden Club. Before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to make a few points about where we are today locally with populations of native plants. 22% of our New England native plants are now considered rare, and 10% of the plants that make up our landscape are invasive. That population is increasing while the native population is decreasing. So what can we do as individual gardeners to stop this? I want to issue a challenge to all of us. Spend the next 8 months identifying every plant on your property. We are the stewards of our landscape, and it is our responsibility to know the plants that we need to eliminate and the plants that we need to encourage to grow and to spread. If that's a challenge for you, I have a suggestion. There's a wonderful app called Inaturalist. You can download it for free. You take a picture with your phone and you submit that picture, and suggestions for identification come up. Those pictures are also reviewed by experts. So there's a pretty good chance that you'll have a positive, accurate identification of that plant. In addition, if you're in Ridgefield, any submission on that app over the next 9 months will automatically be included in the data that's being collected for the natural resource inventory for 2022, which the Conservation Commission and Woodcock Nature Center are currently working on. So get out and take lots of pictures. So Sefra Alexandra, who is known as the seed huntress, is working to preserve biodiversity through the collection and propagation of local native seeds. She has an MA in Agroecological Education from Cornell. She produces the Spartan podcast, founded the BOATanical Expeditions, and leads the Ecotype Project for Connecticut NOFA, which is the Northeast Organic Farmers Association. Dina Brewster was an English teacher in the Bronx before becoming owner and head farmer at the Hickories Organic Farm here in Ridgefield, where they are using conservation agricultural practices to heal the soil. She is the executive director of NOFA and a member of the Ridgefield Garden Club. Jean Linville is a farmer, writer, arts educator, and visual artist with a PhD in interdisciplinary studies. She has worked on the Ecotype Project at the Hickories since its inception. She is a member of the Conservation Commission here in Ridgefield, the Kautatoa Garden Club, and is currently involved with a collaborative multimedia art exhibit at the library which is running through April 22nd. So thank you to all of you for joining us. Thank you to our speakers. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We will take quite a bit of time for questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for having us here. We are, we've talked to so many different groups over the years about this work, but it's always this sort of special honor for me to be able to talk to the people really in our community here in Ridgefield, who I think understand best of all kind of the lay of the land, so to speak, where we are starting this work. Kitsy alluded to this at the beginning, and we were sort of thinking yesterday, so many talks about conservation and the environment begin with the sort of bad news, right? And so we're going to do the same thing, which is, and I'm sure many of you have heard Doug Ptolemy's talks. You've heard just how fractured our landscape is. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about those sort of big and those statistics that probably stop you in your tracks: the loss of birds, the loss of insect abundance, and the import for that with me as a farmer in this community is that I recognize in a way that probably is more acute to my livelihood that I am dependent on those insects for my salary and for the production of food and the food security of our community here. I recognize that when they go, the birds, the bees, we go. And so what brought me to this work, however, though having heard, and read Doug Ptolemy's books, having heard the lectures, I sort of came to the Ecotype Project and founded it with Jean and Sefra, for me, through a sort of circuitous route. And so the problem that we are facing is really about the degradation and the fragmentation of our landscape in the Northeast. If you think back over, history, it has been a pretty systematic displacement of people, displacement of ecology, that has broken our landscape up and therefore compromised the abundance of this landscape. It has hurt both our food system, it has hurt the natural populations of insects and birds and mammals and all of nature. And so in wanting to do something about that problem that seems so insurmountable, I always turn to the landscape that I know best, which is the landscape of our farm here at the Hickories. And a number of years ago, and this is sort of a strange way of introducing the Ecotype Project, but a number of years ago, I got really interested in figuring out how my life could help to define a solution to that. And one of the things I did was start a trout pond here at the farm. Some of you probably were aware of that when I did it, but I renovated this massive, big old farm pond, and I stocked it with trout, and I was so proud of myself, and I was excited to be able to offer trout to fresh fish to people in our community. And one of the fellows who had been consulting with me said, the reason that trout are so compromised in Connecticut, the reason it's so hard to raise them is that you aren't going to have enough bugs around this pond to feed the trout. And I said, my God, there's bugs everywhere. I got, mosquitoes and flying and, things up my nose while I'm working, and there's got to be tons of bugs. And he said, no. And he started to educate me about this sort of loss of insects. A 74% decline is staggering. And what that does is it means that people have to then start, said, well, you're going to have to start feeding fish food, corn and soy fish food to these trout to keep them alive, unless you put in enough native plants around this pond to feed the fish. And so that's the sort of strange way in which, by trying to, increase meat and protein sales to people in this community, I started raising trout, therefore got interested in insects, and therefore got interested in native plants. And so it's indicative of the fact that our food web, just like the natural food shed and the natural web of nature, is all connected. And therefore, I sort of started planting these native plants all around the pond. I put in a couple of installations here and there around the farm, and of course turned to one of my good friends, Jean, who I've worked with forever here. We put them in, and then we sat back and began to watch what happened. And those little gardens became the place that we all met at 5 o'clock at the end of the day to chit chat. They became the place that farmers would go to have their lunches, because they became these magnetic spaces where birds and butterflies and bees and they were always in activity. And it began to change the culture of our farm too. And so healing the landscape, what we're talking today about, trying to sort of increase the number of native plants that are growing in this ecoregion, and the restoration of seed, is about sort of a cultural shift as well, and a reparation to our landscape. And when you think of the way this part of the world may have looked hundreds and hundreds of years ago before Europeans began to sort of take our bites away at it. And think about sort of honoring this land and honoring not just the people, but the activities and the plant and animal life of this land. The restoration becomes, and the conservation becomes, a much bigger and more exciting and beautiful word to me than it ever was 3 years ago when I started on this project. So that's just a way of sort of painting a larger backdrop. Sefra is going to talk a little bit about how we begin and what we learned about installing ecotypic native plants, which is, I think, part of our focus today is really to take our general understanding that we probably have collectively as garden clubs about the importance of native plants and then drill it down to an understanding of ecotypes. So over to you, Sefra, for that.
Hi, everyone. So great to be here. And I want to kind of paint the work that we're doing in, frame in a little bit of a national scope, just to give you a background as you are the conservation group of your garden club, how this really fits into what's going on across our country. So as you heard, I call myself the seed huntress. And for the past decade, I've worked in various efforts in seed conservation. So ex situ, the fancy word for in those seed vaults, like at Svalbard, the global seed vault, or across our country, saving rare and wild seed. And so I think if we can take a second and we think about your favorite meadow in Ridgefield, and you think about, for some reason, knock on wood, a fire comes and burns out that whole meadow. And those are all the plants that have been there since you've all lived here, since anyone can remember. What resource do you go to reseed that field? As a conservation commission, where is your ex situ, right? Where's that backup seed storage that you can access that's the right plant genetic material to be able to replant those areas? So that type of question actually was a question that the entire country, in 2014, the Plant Conservation Alliance, which is a great alliance that is kind of the umbrella alliance that the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management and all of these federal agencies work under. And they all said, hey, if we face these natural disasters or, man-made disasters, we don't have any resource or recourse to be able to have this truly local native plant material we need to be able to restore our lands. And so this massive cohort got together, and what they did was they architected what's known as the National Seed Strategy. So what the National Seed Strategy does is lays out the goals and the process, which we'll talk about how we've adapted it for us at the Ecotype Project. But it says, how can we sustainably and respectfully take seeds from the wild, safeguard them, collect them, make sure that we're taking the provenance, where they're from, taking herbaria, the dried plant specimens to send to the Smithsonian so you have a record of these species. And so how do we go from the botanists who can wild collect these seeds to farmers and growers that can amplify these specialty crop seeds, right? The Ecotype Project works under a USDA specialty crop block grant, where our specialty crop is the native seed. So we take the seed from the wild, we grow it out with farmers, and then you have to collect it and you have to clean it, which is very fun and very involved. And then you have to store it so that in cases of disaster, where we see all these wildfires out west, that there are massive amounts of seeds available to immediately start regenerating these areas that get destroyed. So in different parts of our country, we do have a much more well-functioning seed supply chain that's due to, a lot more of the BLM and the federal money is out there, a lot more of the wild lands. And they have these huge storage facilities and these huge, increased sites where they can grow out those seeds. But here in the Northeast, we don't have that. So I just wanted you to know that there is a national strategy, and we very much work within that framework that they've laid out. Another great thing to know about is the Society of Ecological Restoration is a wonderful society. They do a number of fantastic publications and webinars. And within the Society of Ecological Restoration, they have a specific working group which is the International Network for Seed-Based Restoration. And it was great because the Ecotype Project was invited to present alongside with these other seed supply initiatives all around the world. And you said, oh, great, other places in the world, they have to have figured this out. turns out a lot of these other supply networks all around the world are asking the same questions that the Ecotype Project has been asking. So as we sit in the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, there's actually quite a bit of money that's being dispersed for native plant materials development, which is just the fancy word for having a native seed supply chain. But the problem is, there's no standards around native seed, right? So people are being shipped these bags that have no germination. They haven't been tested for how much pure live seed, like how much of that seed is actually viable. Much with our agricultural and horticultural seed, there's a number of standards, right? Because you can, as farmers, you need to know exactly when things germinate and how long until they fruit and all those types of things. But that's really never been done with native seed. So this special issue that I'm showing you here has been a great reference guide for these people all over the world who are working with this to try and have a shared framework around these standards as we create these truly local native supply chains. So just to give you a frame, so that was national, right? But now let's get geographically located. And for those of you who haven't seen, this is what's known as an ecoregion map. It comes from the EPA, a wonderful gentleman, James Obernick, who used to work for the military, and he knew soils so well, he could say, planes can land here, troops can march here, and so forth. And when he was at the EPA, he was noticing that all these different people who work in conservation, from the hydrologists who work on water, ornithologists, birds, forestry folks, everyone was working off of a slightly different data set. And what that was doing was kind of deterring away from everyone rowing their boats together with these conservation initiatives. Because if we put our bug eyes on, right, when we're flying over the land, we don't see where Connecticut ends and Massachusetts begins. We see the riparian corridors and the broadleaf forests, or the coastal areas. So what this does is an artistic broad stroke overlay of these different ecologies, and says, from a plant genetics perspective, we sit here in Ecoregion 59, which hopefully we're making the coolest ecoregion in the country. If you collect genetics anywhere within Ecoregion 59, you can be sure that you can spread any of those seeds throughout that region, and you know that you're putting the right plants in the right place. So this is an Ecoregion level 3 map. Doug Tallamy works off of a level 1, so much bigger swath. Like there's only 8 different ecoregions when you go to level 1. So when he recommends native plants for the East, you're looking at a much larger area, but we're zooming in. And you can actually also zoom in even further to a level 4, which hopefully in the future, there's 59G, which would be the coastal areas of Connecticut and so forth. But for right now, this is the framework that we're working off of. And so what ecotype means, ecotypic is describing those genetics, like when we're walking out in the truly wild places. We now live in a very fragmented landscape, but when we're back out in the wild places, those areas that haven't been disturbed, those genetics that have been adapting to our climate and the local pollinators since time immemorial. We think about, we save our heirlooms, right? What we like, what tastes good, what does well where we are. Well, our pollinator friends are doing the same thing. And those are ecotypes. So that is where that Ecotype Project comes from. So when we look to all the different industries that utilize native seed, there was a great study that came out of the Mid-Atlantic Regional Seed Bank, which is run by Ed Toth, who just stepped away from running the Greenbelt Native Plant Nursery in New York City, and they provided all of the ecotypic plant material. They provided all the ecotypic plant material for the New York City boroughs. And he and Sarah Tangren did a study of all the folks that use native plants in the East. And they said, okay, well, what are you using this for? So you can see here, from restoration to pollinator support to wildlife habitat, all of these folks, 74% of the time, they were saying, we want ecotypic seed, right? We want to use these truly local genetics for our projects and when we build up these habitats. The problem is, what these red dots show is in these areas, that truly local plant material is almost never available. So if you can think about with the food movement, when we had to localize the food movement, know your farmer, bring in that food shed, right? We want to be buying food that's grown locally. Well, now we really need to have that conversation around creating what Ken Green at the Hudson Valley Seed Company coined a seed shed. So we want to make sure that we're growing, collecting, and sharing seed all within a localized area. So these red dots are saying, the closest plant material place where they're buying plants is 400 miles away and then 800 miles away. And so what that does when we're, predominantly buying our seeds from, big seed companies like Ernst in the Midwest, that's adapted to their amount of sunlight they get, to their soils. And you might not think that it matters that much, but when you think about a monarch on a 5-year migration, if our milkweeds are blooming a little bit too longer, well, then they're missing like the domino effect all the way down the coastline when those other ecotypic species will be blooming. So not to villainize anyone who's bought native plants from the Midwest, but we're just trying to elevate a conversation of saying, let's start asking our nursery growers where your plant material comes from. So the last slide that I'll be sharing, I'll hand it over to Jean, is when we look at that national seed strategy framework, we say, how can we adapt that to weaving a seed supply chain here in the Northeast? Because as I said before, in other parts of the country it exists, here it really doesn't. And there's great folks all over, like Native Plant Trust. There's a woman out on Long Island, Heather McCargo in Maine. There were these different people doing this work, but they've never all really been woven together. And that's a lot of what the Ecotype Project has been working to do. So how do we get seeds from the wild into production and to you all? Well, it starts with botanists, namely Jordy Elkins at Highstead and Reading, who works under these protocols, Seeds of Success, which is, again, a federal government initiative that says, let's not take all the seeds that are out in the wild, make sure that we're only collecting enough that we don't wipe out these last vestiges of these populations in the wild, and, taking those herbaria and doing all of that data collection to make sure we know where these seeds come from. We also want to encourage that when we give these talks, that we're not encouraging everyone to go out into these last stands to collect this seed. We want to make sure that we're having the folks who are well-trained and able to identify the species and so forth, that they're the ones doing this work. Because luckily there's laws that say you can't sell seed directly from the wild to an end user, and that kind of protects this beautiful natural resource that is this shared beautiful, these living embryos of seed. So Jordy collects the wild species that we bring into the pipeline, and then we bring it to Jean and Dina at the Hickories, and we take 200 plugs of those species that we collected, and we plant them out just like you would a row of cucumbers or tomatoes, growing it for, again, that specialty crop, the seed. And then we go in and we'll collect the seed when it's ripe, because seed is a fruit and you want it to get to that peak ripeness when it's dry and anemockery, when the wind would blow it off, all these fancy words for seed dispersal. You see the pappuses of the dandelions. So that's when you're collecting those seeds. Then you get to have the fun journey of cleaning them. We have a cool machine called the Winnow Wizard that helps us do that. And then we get it to our nursery partners. We've been working a lot with Planter's Choice, Daryl Newman. That's a wholesale nursery, so encourage your landscapers to get in touch with him. And then we get that back out through plant sales and all of these different mechanisms, which we'll show you, so that you all can be putting this back in the landscape, and we can rewild these ecological corridors to fortify the landscape for the pollinators, to ensure they have the food and habitat we need. So as Dina said in the beginning, we have the local food security we need. So that is how our supply chain works. And Jean will tell you how we're implementing it.
Thanks, Sefra. So yeah, as Dina mentioned, we started on this endeavor 4 years ago. This will be our 4th season of growing out plants here at the Hickories. And it's interesting. I like to tell the story that when we first took over the field that's closest to the road, for those of you who know the Hickories, when you drive by, it had always had crops being grown there, either vegetable crops or annual flowers. And when we turned it over to put the ecotypes in there, what was really amazing was that within that first season, the amount and the diversity of pollinators that showed up that we had not been seeing in those fields, even though there were things growing there. So I think it was a real eye-opening to us as far as if you plant it, they will come because they really did. And they came in droves, and it was unbelievable how quickly the word got out in the insect populations about what was there and that they could find food. So it's been interesting to watch the evolution over time and see the populations grow and change as more plants are introduced. So Sefra hit a little bit on some of the things that you're seeing on this slide. At the top center is Jordy Elkins out in the field doing his collection. Generally, they bring in the seed to Highstead and they will do the germination in their greenhouses. And once they have successful germination, we kind of take delivery of the plugs here at the Hickories, and we care for them, we uppot them and get them ready. We get the fields prepared to accept these plants, and then we start putting them in the ground and then watching them. And the first year that we planted them, we really didn't expect much. we kind of thought, oh, we're going to put them in, let's see how they do. And they really outperformed our expectations. Most of them flowered the first year, and several of them actually produced seed the first year, which kind of presented us with a bit of a conundrum, because we're like, oh, wow, now we need to figure out what to do with the seed that we're getting. And it kind of forced us to examine our timeline a little bit faster than we had thought. But we were really pleased in seeing how well that they were settling in and being happy, bringing in all these pollinators, and then also doing such a good job at producing bloom and seed. And so from there, it's been a process of trying to figure out how can we help get this to folks like you that love gardening, belong to garden clubs, are interested in making the world a better place. And that's really, we're in the process, I would still say, of doing that, of trying to figure out, can we partner with nurseries that are willing to grow out seed? Can we distribute seed to individuals and teach them, the rhythms of working with native plants? Because it is different than dealing with annuals, and you kind of have to develop a slightly new vocabulary and a new approach to the way that you're going to handle these, one of which is when. And that's kind of an interesting thing, because we're so programmed by the garden industry and certain holidays to expect blooms early in May. And in the native plant world, that just really isn't the way they operate. They're really just starting to produce their leaves and start soaking in all the energy and getting ready to produce bloom. And really where they start to shine is in the fall, late summer to fall. And they actually love being put in the fall as plants, as plugs. So it's kind of this shift that we need to think about too, and realize that it's still okay if we put our annuals in and we have that pop of color in the spring. But if we're going to also try to slowly transition our spaces, public and private, to be more ecologically balanced, what we have to do is realize that we also have to shift and say, I'm not going to just put things in once in the year. I'm going to do it 2 times, and I'm going to pick in the fall, and I'm going to have some natives that I can put into the fall. And what's nice about putting them in the fall is they have that time to settle in, to get their roots established before the heavy frosts hit. And then come spring, when we get the snow melting slowly into the ground and we get the nice rains, they're awakened and they're ready to go, and they produce much more flowering. They're going to grow taller, all of that with that fall planting. So that's part of the thing to think about with your garden, is kind of looking at the rhythms and maybe the new rhythms. And also, as what was alluded to earlier when Kitsy was talking, get to know your yard and get to know its rhythms, so that you kind of see what natives are already there. When are they appearing? What do they look like? And, you also can do some seed selection there as well. But you can also get seeds from programs like the Eco59 program and be able to stratify them and germinate them and start thinking about growing them out. You grow them out in pots for the summer, and then by fall, they have a nice root ball, they're ready to go in. So there's this whole scheme of folks that are involved. And on our end from farming, The inset picture is me and Abby Carson. Abby Carson is another volunteer here with the Ecotype Project. So the two of us are pretty much have been overseeing most of the crop that's here, which anybody who wants to volunteer, feel free. Give us a call, shoot us an email. We're always looking for extra hands out there. But you can also see the diversity of the farmers right now. Currently, there's about 11 farmers, which is really great. The Hickories was the first farm to participate in the Ecotype project. And in the short time of 3 years to have now 11 farms participating, I think is pretty amazing. And it's been a real learning curve for everyone because there's not information out here on natives, that's especially when it comes to commercially growing them. I mean, we all know that when we, look at our seed packets, when we look at the seed catalogs online, they give us some information, but there's not information particularly about seed collection. They'll talk about, how deep to plant the plug, what kind of light, what kind of soil conditions, but there's never that other end of the life of the plant, which is how do you bring it to seed production? How do you do collection? What does it look like? And that was part of what we were kind of up against here, was trying to figure all of that out. If you go to the next slide, Sefra, that'd be great. So currently at the Hickories, these are the species that we have in Ecotype founder plots. And that was mentioned earlier, but basically a founder plot, you're actually looking at one right here, which is the Joe Pye weed, and then you can kind of see the ironweed next to it. There are approximately 200 plants in each of these plots. We do a condensed spacing, so I'm not using recommended spacing that you'd find on the seed packet, because that's going to just, first of all, take up a huge amount of acreage on the farm. And, we are sharing with food production, so we can't take over the whole farm. We have to be cognizant of that. But it also gives them a little bit more structure, because most of these plants in the wild are growing interspersed with a lot of other natives, including grasses, which helps support them physically. So by doing a condensed spacing, basically I'm doing spacing that's a third of what the normal spacing would be. They are supporting each other. We do have to do some structured support on the outside of the rows for some of the taller species, because they do kind of fall over, because as you'll notice, we keep the edges clean and we have pathways going between them. So they're not in their native environment. And that's something to think about, for the homeowner, if you're going to use some, if you have just containers that you can do, or you're doing a small mailbox garden, it's good to think about what natives would be good there based on the conditions, but also the height. What else is around to support them? Or are you willing to put in an actual physical structure to support them? Because they all have their, different characteristics for the way that they get developed. So one of the things that we do is we kind of go out and about during the day and the night to see what's happening out in these fields. And what's been really interesting is Abby and I have found that the nighttime prowls are wonderful. We're always sure to make sure we text Dina and let her know that we're going to be out in the field, so she sees these headlamps bobbing along. She doesn't think that there's aliens out there or something. But it's been amazing to see how much goes on at night in these flower rows as well. So, and the breadth of diversity of what we're seeing between flies, butterflies, moths, wasps, bees, beetles, spiders. There's this huge range of insects that are out there, and we're gradually hoping to build more of a catalog of actually what's out there. Kim Stoner had a crew out in the field last summer doing bee surveys, but that's a fraction of what's out there. I mean, the bees are there, but there's so many other pollinating forces out there that we're kind of hoping that we can gradually learn more about that and find out what's going out there. But it's been impressive who's shown up for dinner, so to speak. So
they're beneficial too, or something.
There's just all kinds of beneficials. There's predatory beneficials that show up, a huge range. So here, what we do basically is once we have our plugs large enough, we put them into those rows. We monitor them. Some of the plants, including Joe Pine, ironweed, I actually prune them to kind of keep them a little bit more compact. So once the plants are about a foot tall, I'll actually go out and do some very careful selected pruning to encourage them to stay a little bit shorter, because these are plants that will go up to 5-6 feet, which makes it a challenge for seed harvesting. So I try to keep them a little more compact, and we try to keep them right around the 4 to 5 foot range, which is aiding in it. And then in the middle, you can kind of see what this seed head looks like as it's starting to mature. And then there's 2 close-ups that show the seed. The top right is with the pappus still attached to it. It's kind of like the little furry hat that the seed wears. And then down below on that grid is it's a 1/4 inch square, it's 1/4 inch square graph paper to show the scale of the seeds. And you can see once the pappus is cleaned off what the seed actually looks like. So once we bring the seed into storage, we go in and we cut these seed heads as close as we can. We store them to dry. And after they've dried for a month, 2 months, we start the cleaning process of cleaning them and then preparing them to be packaged into the seed packets and made available for sale. So as we started this project, what became really evident was the fact that there wasn't a lot of information on these plants. And so a lot of it became anecdotal. We needed to just watch them ourselves and kind of develop our own protocols. So I worked in conjunction with one of the other botanists at Highstead on developing these cards to kind of give a framework, particularly because as Dina and I were talking about this project, it became evident that the really good goal would be to replicate what we were doing other places and other farms. And so in order to replicate it, I didn't want anybody else to have to go through what we went through, which was trying to figure all of this stuff out. And so that's where these cards came up. And this is what we've done. We have a set now for every species we've had our hands on that goes over growing conditions, recommendations on how to clean. We keep really careful field notes as far as what time of year each of these plants is in various stages, what time of year are we collecting seeds, at how many different points in time do we collect seed, did we have infestations of insects, how did we handle it, did we have a disease problem, did we have a collapse of a crop. All of that stuff gets noted, and hopefully it's just going to build this information bank that will eventually even help a home gardener so that you can get to know the plant more as far as its ins and outs of what could you expect that might happen or that you might see over the course of a year with the plant.
All right. This is back to me. And as I was listening to Jean and Sefra, one of the things that I was thinking about was that I think this is my 4th time addressing the Ridgefield Garden Club and the Catatoa Garden Club. And if I think back over my 15 years of farming, I think my first talk was about becoming a farmer 15 years ago and fruit and vegetable production. And then I think I had everyone out for a luncheon and we talked about livestock production and how important that was, because I was onto livestock and super excited about protein and fiber. And then I think my last talk was on organic flour production. And now my career has like moved again into conservation seed. But so it makes me, of course, begs the question, like, what's my next talk gonna be about? Who knows where I'll be, but I do feel like in many ways, upon reflection about this project, my entire farming career, perhaps my whole life living in, connection to nature and the outdoors, has really led me to this point where it feels like this is the right work to be doing in this moment. As someone who is a farmer, there needs to be, as these Jean and Sefra have illuminated, some voice of production as we think about what's wrong, and why there are not enough ecotypic plants growing in this region and how we can heal that landscape. Our piece of it today is really to talk about the production of that plant material. And so just again, to sort of I think, set that same timeline over the course of my career as a farmer and over the course of my life here in Ridgefield, the rising urgency to figure out ways in which we are going to live on this planet in the future and adapt to the changing climate around us really forces us to look at our landscape and the durability of our landscape. So what we are in essence asking the garden clubs to be allies with Connecticut NOFA, with Ecotype farmers, with native plant nurseries. Garden clubs need to step in, I think, in a very important way to link arms around creating the strongest and most resilient, durable landscape we can, so that we can all be good ancestors moving forward. When we look at the world that we were given and we don't do anything about it, knowing what's coming, then it is really on us. And I think this is kind of our moment as farmers, as conservationists, as backyard and nature enthusiasts, as policy people. Like, we need all boats rowing in the same direction if we are going to restore some kind of durability to this landscape. And so that climate adaptation piece has really been powerful for me. I got into organic farming for that reason, and started growing fruit and vegetables without chemicals for that reason. The idea that we need to sequester carbon, we need to do something about climate adaptation. But as I say, it sort of moves me to this idea of the landscape being more than just my farm now. My responsibility is really to this region, and to try to figure out ways that we can build plants and people and communities that will persist given an unknowable future, which is what we are all facing right now. And so one of the real lessons for me about working with these plants over the last 3 or 4 years has been the value of the genetic diversity. Sorry, Sefra, I'm still going on. I'm still on that past slide. I've got my eye on the clock, don't worry. But the value of diversity in all of this. You've seen, diversity of farmers, diversity of stakeholders, diversity of ecologies. But even if we think about diversity as our number one ally or resource in strengthening our landscape. And that has been, and Sefra alluded to this, but it's been a real lesson for me that if we want to build a landscape that can persist, and we need plants in that landscape that can endure, then taking a native plant from Tennessee and moving it into Connecticut soil doesn't set us up for success. Even if it's a native, that's a really good choice, and God bless you for doing it. But the real setting ourselves up for success is going to be using these ecotypic plants. And they have the best ability to persist in this area because they are from this area. It makes such sense to me, of course, even though it has been a complete paradigm shift as a farmer and as a gardener. I am not used to looking for diversity in my garden. I'm used to looking for uniformity. And so when we select or when we choose these plants and we put them back in our landscape, it's important that we value the diversity that they bring. And that diversity is sort of best stated, I think, when we look at the seed they produce. So the regular sort of life cycle of a plant, as you saw, ends with the production of seed. And each of those seeds, just like human beings, we all create children who don't look exactly like our parents, their parents rather. Many of these plants are doing the same thing. They are putting in or evolving in these micro adaptations live time with our climate as it's changing. And so being able to support those changes and that genetic adaptation that is made possible by seed production and by following the plants live time as they adapt is kind of the lesson learned here for me. Because so often as a grower, we don't value that diversity, and we select for the proven winner that's going to look exactly the same way every time and grow exactly this tall and be exactly that fluffy. And so what we're really asking you guys to join us in doing is to kind of shift that paradigm away to, and some percentage of your garden, in some percentage of my farm, away from the proven winners and into this world of ecotypic natives that will be here long after we are gone. And so in valuing the seed and its ability to adapt, it's been a huge learning curve for me to take on becoming a seed grower. I've never done that before. And so the last 4 years has been, another shelf of books to read and another million farmers to visit, and webinars like this to attend, and start really championing the use of seed. And I will say, in painting a sort of even larger than life, anecdote around this effort, when we started growing ecotypic seed, and working with the Connecticut Ag Experiment Station and the Native Plant Working Group, there was a group of us 4 years ago, sitting around the table in New Haven, maybe 5 or 10 of us sitting around a small table in New Haven talking about the importance of ecotypic plants. And at our last meeting of the Native Plant Working Group, it was, standing room only. The DOT was there, the Department of Transportation was there saying, if you have ecotypic seeds, we need to plant corridors up, I-84 to help insects and mammals and birds move through this state. And we at the Department of Transportation are not home gardeners, so we need to be able to throw seed out and know that it will persist. And the seed that is coming from other places in the country that is thrown out into this landscape just can't make it when Connecticut does what it does, which is hot, cold, wet, dry, sunny, shady, whatever the craziness of our landscape it brings. So I think, the import of these small packets of seed extend, into larger climate adaptation strategies for our entire region. And so all along that little cycle that Jean and Sefra were moving through, the botanists, the farmers, the gardeners, or the nursery growers, the gardeners, the seed keepers, the seed cleaners, all of those folks this is an emerging industry for our area. And so each of them needs support along the way. Sefra and I, just on the back of an envelope one day, said it costs about, I think it was around $3,000 to take a species that is living in the wild, many of them, are struggling to survive in wild spaces, and bring it into abundance in production, make it available to any gardener or farmer in the state who wants to put these into production. And when you think about how valuable that is as a service to our landscape moving forward, it's a tiny amount of resource. We just need to do the work and make it available. And so we have all of these wonderful botanists. We have a group of fantastic farmers who are learning how to grow seed crops for the first time in Connecticut. And that's been exciting. Sefra has done a ton of outreach work with them. And the Ecotype Project is, supported by so many people who want to see this kind of education continue for growers. And then there are farmers, and it's sort of funny, along the way of this project evolving, we sort of got to this slide and everyone said, well, how can we buy the seed? We said, we don't know that yet. Give us 6 months. And so, where can we get the plants? And we said, oh, we don't know that yet. Give us 6 months. And so we've been sort of working each part of this cycle, making the road by walking, as they say. And so when the first seed crops came in, we figured out how to clean them, which took some interesting winter months together. We got them all cleaned. And then we suddenly said, well, if we need to get these back out into the landscape, we need a small seed company. So that's what I've been able to do at the Hickories, is launch Eco59. So with all of the other farmers in this collective, Emily at Hilltop Hanover, Patrick at Waldingfield, a number of us, Will over at Stone Acres and Stonington, a number of us have these seed crops that we have produced. In order to get them to you, it turns out there's a lot of rules and laws about how you sell seeds. So someone had to go through the paperwork, and I'm decent at that. So that's what I did, is I sort of have made this small seed company housed in Ridgefield, Connecticut, as an arm of the Hickories, our regular farm production, that will move this seed all over the ecoregion. Anybody from Portland, Maine, which is also in our ecoregion, down to New York City, up into the Hudson Valley. This is their genetics. This is their seed. This is the seed of our landscape. And so to make it available, we have gotten a seed labeler's license, and we've packed up all these cute, if I don't mind saying so, little packs of seed. Some of the farmers in the collective have actually done the artwork for the seed packets, which is pretty extraordinary, and I feel very fortunate for that. So Jean and Abby and everybody has stepped in to really launch this company and make these seeds available to you. There are other folks. Heather McCargo up in Maine, the Wild Seed Project, has been a real mentor for us as well in terms of doing this work and making sure that that there is plenty of education and outreach around the production of these species. So I would definitely look to her as well. But now, Sefra, we can advance to the next. Thanks for that time. You can go online, eco59.com. You can show up here to the farm store at the Hickories, whatever you want. Tell every gardener you know from Portland, Maine to the Hudson Valley that these seeds are available, and that we are encouraging people to make sure that they adopt, native seed, and then within that, ecotypic native seed. But the value of it, remember, is that even though the packet says New York ironweed or butterfly weed or foxglove or whatever the seed is, it's important to remember that within that packet, each of those seeds carries those micro adaptations, those lifetime, real-time, here and now adaptations that make them the best possible choice for persisting in 2022 in what Connecticut has to bring. They represent an unbroken string of successes in their adaptations and evolution. Though the packet says the same thing, they're all slightly different. Some may end up a tiny bit taller, some may end up a little bit bushier. And we really want to support those adaptations. And so we encourage people, when possible, to grow from seed or to ask their nursery growers, are these plants that you've produced in your nursery started from seed? Because many folks will, in the nursery trade, are just cloning. They take one nice plant and they make cuttings, and all they've done is create clones, which, is, and Sefra has a wonderful slide that will temper some of my, enthusiasm about this, but it is important to think at least about the seed grown ecotypic native as the sort of best possible choice. Ask your nursery growers to produce it. We're asking the garden clubs to produce it when possible. And then once you have these seeds in your hand, they also require a slightly different touch. And so the stratification guidelines for native seeds, a big word, which just means how you get them started, are really about trying to mimic as much as we can as gardeners. And again, it's this sort of paradigm shift for me, but mimic as much as we can the natural processes in which these plants would germinate, in which they would thrive. So at this time of year, if you're ordering seed, you need to fake out these plants, these seeds, to make them think they have gone through a winter, because their natural time to be planted would be in the fall, when they blow off their mother plant or get picked up by a bird and moved in the landscape and hit the ground. They would naturally be planted in the fall. They would go through the freeze and thaw cycles of an entire Connecticut or Massachusetts winter, and then they would germinate in the spring. If you buy them in the spring, then you need to mimic that same process by putting them in a cold, wet fridge and making them live in that fridge for about a month to trigger them to wake up. And depending on the seed, each seed has its own set of guidelines. So not every seed needs cold, wet stratification. You'll look on the, look up the species, look on the back of the card that you get with it, Google them as you find ecotypic seed, and you'll see which ones need to be cold, wet stratified. You'll basically put them on a damp paper towel, or coffee filter actually works better. Put them in a single layer in a Ziploc bag or a glass container or whatever you have that will remain watertight. Get that nice and keep it nice and damp for however long that seed needs to stratify, 30 days, 60 days. If you see them sprouting, you take them out and you sow them right away, but generally you just wait the 30 days or 60-day window, and then you sow them in the ground so that they are ready to wake up, that they have been, triggered that it's spring.
Just an addendum on that is that if you do a tray and you get partial germination, I would hang on to whatever doesn't germinate, because the other thing that we're discovering with a lot of these seeds is that there seems to be part of that micro programming that Dina was talking about, is that some of them seem to be programmed to not necessarily sprout that first year. They might sprout the second year. So what we have found is that sometimes you can have a tray, the stuff that germinates, you pull it out, pot it or plant it, whatever you want, then leave the tray there and leave it there all winter. And then next spring, sometimes those areas are now sprouting because those plants have now said, oh, this is my time to wake up. So yeah.
It is amazing, the sort of adaptations that it's brilliant. The more I'm used to working with native plants, the more I learn about how absolutely magnificent nature is at putting those safeties in, so that if all of the plants of that mother plant, as Jean said, if they were all to germinate on the same day, and that day was too hot or too cold or too wet or too dry, they wouldn't survive. So you're absolutely right. That mother plant builds in those fail safes to make sure that some of her babies wake up a month later or a year later. And it's just staggering. So the seed company is live. It sounds like we will be offering some seed at the Garden Club plant sale this spring. So I hope to see many of you there. And obviously we will also have tours of the Ecotype seed farm here at the Hickories. So make sure that I'll publicize those to Kitsy, and make sure if you're not subscribed to our newsletter at the Hickories that you do that, and you'll be kept abreast if you do want to come over and take a walk with us one day through the seed crops and the native plants. Sefra, I'm going to turn it back to you for a minute, because I do think that sort of the practical guidelines for garden club folks, for farmers, for gardeners, landscapers even, it's important to know that this is a newly emerging market. We only have 18 or 20 species in production right now, 18, I guess, total. We'll have 22 by the end of this year. And since there are so few, we want to, we know that we have to rely on other parts of the market. So Sefra, you may want to describe that to folks.
So part of the native plant working group that we all are on, there's a wonderful woman, Lydia Pan, who's the chapter president for something called Wild Ones, which is a great organization that supports education and information about native plants and natural landscapes. And she's been giving these types of talks too, as we all have been explaining what ecotypes are and what ecoregions are and why it's important to grow these plants from seed. And again, as Dina said, when you grow plants from seed, you're maintaining that largest arc of diversity. It's like the painter's palette of ecology, right? You want to make sure that we're getting the seeds that come out at the earliest time of the season, and the seeds that are fully ripe at the end of a season, just to help preserve those arcs of diversity. Because as Eco59 sends these seeds out, who knows where these little seeds are going to end up, what that landscape holds, what your specific home site is like. So we want to make sure that we preserve as much of that diversity as possible. When I was doing my field work for the Crop Trust, which oversees that Svalbard Global Seed Vault, as a gene bank impacts fellow, a gene bank's a fancy word for a seed bank, I went and studied the crop taro. Maybe some of you have had poi if you've been to Hawaii, but it's the 14th most eaten vegetable in the world. It's a staple food crop for a lot of subsistence farming nations. And just like you may have heard of, I'm sure you've all heard of the Irish potato famine. This was the South Pacific's version of the Irish potato famine, because even though these plants looked slightly different, some had red stems, some had bigger leaves, whatever it was for their characteristics, it turns out in 1993 on the island of Samoa, a blight, a Phytophthora came in, and within 6 weeks, all of the taro had been wiped out. This is a cultural totem given in rituals of birth, life, and marriage, on every plate, every meal, a huge part of their economy. And the thing is with plants, a lot of times that are recalcitrant. So common seeds that you can dry out or desiccate, like your tomatoes and your cucumbers, those are orthodox seeds. But oftentimes in the tropics, they're recalcitrant. So what you have to do to propagate them is you take cuttings. And what happens when you take cuttings is that you're just proliferating those same genetics again and again and again. And what that does is provide a monoculture of genetics that's really susceptible to either shifts in climate or if a pest comes in. So it's really important to think about those types of examples in history and understanding why we really want to put as much diversity onto our landscape, even within those different species. So when Lydia Pan would give this talk, people would often say, as you saw with that map at the beginning that I showed, I can't find ecotypic species. So, obviously our best choice, right, is seed grown, provenance, truly local, ecotypic, native plant species, right? When we can find that, when we can ask our nursery growers, when we can create that demand and the supply starts to increase, that is the best thing for supporting this, symphony of ecology in our backyards, as those photos that Jean showed with all of those amazing pollinators. And they showed me a picture of these loopers, they're caterpillars that camouflage themselves with different petals on their backs. I mean, it's just so cool what's out there. And I know almost nothing about entomology, but I'm learning. So when you can't find that truly local native seed grown plants, then you want to find seed grown native plants, even if it's from outside the ecoregion, right? Because species ranges are quite vast. And so as long as we're making sure we're doing the best we can to preserve that seed grown, that diversity, then that's your next best choice. So nativars, again, as Dina alluded to, those are the native plants that you're saying, I like that it's, this tall, this color. You're selecting for a lot of those characteristics and traits. And that, again, is that vegetative propagation that makes it all that one genetic strain and makes it less resilient. But again, if they are providing ecological functions, if there is nectar in it, if there, is habitat it can provide for your pollinators, then that's a better choice than the other choices we can make. If we think about, not to vilify anyone who has hydrangeas, but they're actually not true flowers, right? And don't provide any nectar. So we want to make sure that we balance the aesthetic with also the ecological. So that's why saying, if you must, we do, of course, there's all these beautiful plants. And as folks on this call, we all love the beauty of nature. So there's certainly a place for that on your landscape. But as Edwina von Gall in her 2/3 for the Bird Initiative says, let's make sure that at least 2/3 of our landscape is supporting habitat and pollinators. And then, of course, recommending against not planting any of the invasive or exotic species. Dina, Jean, do you have anything else you wanted to add to that scale of permanence? Good. Okay.
No, other than just to sort of commiserate, because I think in some ways, we all make these compromises in our farms and gardens, right? I mean, I'm growing tomatoes from Peru and arugula from Italy. Our entire food system isn't native. So most of my farm, is not these plants. Most of our food is not these plants. And many of your gardens, I think, I always worry in these initiatives of mine, because I feel so passionately about it. The best example I can come up with is that as an organic farmer, a lot of times if I see a friend or go to a friend's house for dinner, someone says, "Oh God, Dean, I'm so sorry. The potatoes aren't organic. Can you eat them?" I think, oh my goodness, of course, we all love some of, everybody loves a beautiful hydrangea in their wedding bouquet. And I think that we have to be reasonable and kind to ourselves as we begin to march our landscape forward in the right direction. So absolutely, Edwina's 2/3 is a lovely bar to shoot for. And if you have Tennessee milkweed in your backyard, I mean, this slide helps us understand that it's certainly better than planting a Japanese barberry, which is what, you know, the farmer did here 60 years ago. So in his garden. So I think it is sort of an evolution over time. And I would just encourage us all to kind of march together forward as best we can.
Yeah. And as we wrap up our presentation, so we can make sure we have time for all of your questions and any discussion that comes out of this, you know, after almost 3 years of all of us giving these presentations, when everyone said, we all want ecotypes, where can we buy it? You know, for so long we had to say like, nowhere. And now, so I think like this next slide is almost the most exciting, if it will, there we go. Now we actually have places that we can point you to. So of course with seed, your local, so cool that we're talking to Ridgefield right now, Eco59, and the Wild Seed Project, again, Heather McCargo up in Maine, she does these beautiful publications where she makes winter sowing, which was that stratification illustration we showed you just a little bit, like a lot of these more complicated topics of like which plants bloom throughout the seasons, making sure you're feeding, you know, the pollinators all throughout the seasons. She really illustrates that really beautifully. So definitely check out her work. And she has a rewilding pledge you can take where she sends a lot of great information. The Aspetuck Land Trust, I believe, I have to check on this, but I think their plant sale will start going live early April. And they do a great job of making a lot of ecotypes, and when not ecotypes, just really great native plants available for the landscape. And then you have Earth Tones in Tiny Meadow Farm, started by Shannon Siegel, who was part of this original cohort in getting the Ecotype Project launched. She just started a new nursery that has both has an ecotypic native and also non-native, but very beneficial, highly attractive plants to pollinators. And she's in Danbury, right? Yeah, that's right. That's Danbury. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Hilltop Hanover Farm. They're the other ones who have over 17 founder plot species, and they also do a great plant sale. And the Hickories also, as a nursery, they do a plant sale now as well. So yeah, support all of these great places. And also the nursery that we work with, Daryl Newman at Planter's Choice, has been awesome and been such a great supporter of all of this. He's a wholesale nursery. So if any of you work with landscapers and so forth, ask them to purchase their ecotypes from Daryl. He actually has a whole list of ecotypes that he puts out. So this is where you can go. And now we can open it up to anyone who has any questions.
Yep, Kitsy, you're muted.
You're on mute, yep.
Thank you. Something I hear all the time. Can you see the questions?
I'm just cruising through them now. Yeah.
So you can see them.
Got it. I can certainly tackle the why do you need to clean the seeds you collect? That's a really good question. And I've been asking myself that a lot because it's such a pain in the neck to clean them. For anyone putting them directly back out in the landscape, you do not. So these plants are, they have that pappus. Many of them have some form of transportation for themselves, whether it's little wings or something. And that you can leave on. They are meant to sort of return to the landscape. We clean them because if we are going to store them for any length of time, that pappus has usually some moisture in it. And we want to be able to keep the driest possible seed so that it stays vigorous for as long as possible. But, someone was asking me, can I collect the seed off the ecotypes that I buy, right? If you go and buy, an ecotype from Aspetuck or the Ridgefield Garden Club, if they're selling ecotypes, or seed from anywhere, if you buy that ecotypic plant material, is it okay to collect that seed? And the whole point is yes. You want to collect it, you want to keep it going in the landscape. The challenge about seeding directly from the plants, and this is a little bit an extension of that question, to just take seed off a plant and sprinkle it in your garden will work. But remember that seed and plant material is bird food. It is bird seed in the landscape. That is what it is intended to do, is to feed animals and insects and things in the winter. And so you run the risk of losing a lot of that seed to all of the animals who are waiting for it. And if you really want to see it successful, it can often mean potting it up yourself, putting it under a little screen to protect it, just the seeds that you've chosen so they can grow more successfully. But for us, our seed cleaning process is really about the retail sale of the seed. And I think, it is a good question. I hope anyway, that it contributes to the longevity of the seed. It's kind of the quickest answer. You guys want to grab any of the other ones? I bought a meadow mix.
I can't see them, but
I'm happy to read them. Dina touched on this a little bit before about climate change. There's a lot of discussion about whether it's okay to plant native plants from a little bit to the south of us. Are they going to adapt better as the climate changes? I think there's a lot of research that says not necessarily, that we're better off using what is ecotypical appropriate, but maybe you have some other feelings about that.
No, I've generally read that same data, that it's better to use the plants from this region. The one thing I can say about our farming adaptations to climate change is that, these plants not only have they have this sort of triple win, meaning that they hold the soil, and they can sequester carbon, but they are perennials. Everything we're growing right now, I mean, the Hirta is self-seeding, but it is a perennial plant. And so therefore, on a farm or in a garden where you may be tilling up soil to change out annuals every year, these plants are perennial, and that allows them to sequester more carbon, to draw down more carbon into healthier soils than those that are tilled annually. So just planting perennials alone is a climate adaptation strategy. They also hold soil in the winter. So we have planted some of ours on slopes as a way of holding our soil in the off season, as another climate adaptation strategy. And then, of course, supporting pollinators, birds, and the ecosystem around us is the sort of third win of these plants. So I see it as, for me, a sort of climate smart ag practice in general, to have these plants in the landscape. And the more we can restore other ecologies, meadows and things like that, the stronger we will be when we face those changes that are coming.
I can add to that a little bit. I think what's important to remember is, like, nature is so much smarter than we are, right? And I think that the importance of this work is we're putting these seeds in situ. That means in the soil, in the living seed bank, versus ex situ, which is out of the soil in those, locked away storage facilities. And so we have to remember that each year the seeds that are in our ecoregion are adapting to these slight shifts, are adapting to what's coming up and down. So when we preserve, again, those huge arcs of diversity, there's already intelligence embedded within that is fluctuating on the edges of those changing climates. So not only is that actually probably the best genetics, I mean, and of course, as Dina mentioned, there's a ton of different thought and, white papers on this type of a topic. But what you can bet is we have to promote that. What the Ecotype Project is doing is creating a model. If we can create a model that can be replicated by all of these other different ecoregions, then at least if somewhere there's a safeguarded backup supply of this ecotypic plant material, then yes, maybe in the future, if 84 is now better suited for 59, at least there's a resource of it. But until then, we want to make sure that we're safeguarding, conserving, proliferating the wild genetics and kind of I personally think just trusting in their adaptability and in their deep intelligence. Yeah.
Thanks, Sefra. So someone bought meadow mix and didn't stratify it, did not stratify it. Can they still plant them in the spring?
Yeah, so I'm actually putting seeds in the fridge this afternoon, by April 1, that need that 30-day stratification so that I can plant them out in May and then in June. This is absolutely the right time to be stratifying, for sure.
Okay, great. And then similar to that, someone has some seed bombs in their fridge, some of your seed bombs, and what do they need to do to transition them out of the
lob them out into the landscape.
Throw them out there.
If they've already been stratified, there
Slingshot.
we go. The other thing I should say, and it says this on the seed bombs, and it says it on the back of the seed packets and all of that. This entire initiative has been made possible because of Sefra's work at Connecticut NOFA. And so I've been really struck too that the Ecotype Project has had this sort of loving spirit of collaboration around it since its inception. But we all know, at least at Connecticut NOFA, that sort of arm of our work, that it takes a ton of financial support to get this project off the ground. And so the farmers at Eco59, the nursery growers who are part of our initiative, we have all agreed to give a portion of our profits back to the Ecotype Project. So those seed bombs actually have sort of the largest following, and they, to some small portion of our sales, to some small part, that profit goes back to CT NOFA. Obviously, we need tons of you to step up and donate and help and get behind this work as well. And our members and donors have made this possible. But it is exciting to be part of a sort of socially conscious brand as well, that Planter's Choice writes a check back to Connecticut NOFA every year and says, we appreciate the marketing and the education around this work. And so hearing that you guys have those seed bombs is exciting for me, because it means that it's working and that they'll actually get back out into the landscape.
Okay, thank you. At the Hickories, do you sow your seeds in the fall?
What we've started doing is we do an overwintering stratification. So obviously most of the seed that we harvest is dried and prepared for sale, but we save a portion of it every year. And what we do is we sow it across flats. And then we have built these frames. It's like a picture frame, but taller. And then it has hardware cloth on the top and bottom, and the trays are placed in there, and they're just left out in the fields so that they experience all the conditions. And I do this at home on a smaller scale. I have one flat that I collect seeds from things in my yard, and I just kind of label the flat, put them out there. I just make sure they're encapsulated in some kind of screening. It stays out there all winter. And then gradually in the spring, you'll start to see things popping up, and it does happen at random times, even within one species. So I just kind of keep the tray there, and as they pop their heads up, I grab them and I pull them out and I up pot them. I also wanted to piggyback way back to something that Kitsy, you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation about folks taking pictures and uploading it to iNaturalist. And some people might not be really comfortable with iNaturalist or don't know about it. So I wanted to also circle back to the other hat I wear along with Kitsy, which is the Ridgefield Conservation Commission. And we have a great training video on iNaturalist on how to use it on the website. So if you're confused or you want to learn more about it before you try it, just go on to the Ridgefield Conservation website and you'll see the training video. It'll help you out.
Thanks, Jean. It's pretty intuitive, but it's helpful to have the video. Someone asked about the science behind the drawing of the Ecoregion map. Is it climate or plants that it's using the data from?
Yeah. So if you just type into Google EPA ecoregions, you can read a lot of the white papers, again, by the first author on those papers is James Obernick. And what he'll tell you is all of the different data sets that they combined and overlaid. So if you can think about, if I'm working off of how much water or rainfall comes into an area, or, what the predominant cover crop of forest species are, or what different animals are creating their habitats and what their migration patterns are. They really overlaid a lot of those different data sets. And it was those overlays, when you put those different data sets over each other, they found, again, they are a bit of like these broad stroke artistic delineations of those areas. It's not perfect, and they don't say it's perfect, but certainly what it is it just provides a common framework. It provides a baseline for everyone to be working off of. And with this type of work, it's so nice because we all have a seat at the table in this work. And it's so exciting because it brings the scientist and the botanist and the ecological restorationists and the land trusts and the garden clubs and, all the great work of the pollinator pathway that really paved the way for this. And then you all with your ability to help, spread this message. So that's just a way to say, I really encourage you all to read more about ecoregions and how they were formed. But it definitely is overlays of both plant and animal and habitat and all sorts of different sciences to create that framework.
Yeah.
So someone asked about sowing the seeds in the fall without putting them in pots. That probably goes back to the same concern earlier about birds, but
Yeah, they'll disappear amazingly fast between voles, chipmunks, birds, mice.
Yeah.
They get carried off. Ants, they get carried off by everything. So even putting them in screening, you're still going to lose some, believe it or not, but you'll keep most of them.
They will be a service to the environment.
Actually,
still.
and we tend to overseed. Like, what I tend to do is open trays. I'm not doing cell trays. So we'll do open flat trays and just kind of overseed it, like more than you'd anticipate, because we know we're giving some away. And we know that some aren't going to germinate this year. So we kind of try to do it that way. Yeah.
So here's a great question, because I struggle with this as well. What's the best place to research what plants are ecotypical for us? There are a lot of different lists. What are the best lists to be working on?
Lists. I would probably start at Native Plant Trust. Sefra, you may want to jump in. I've sort of used those guys, those folks as a go-to. They have a ton of educational materials as well. I do think it is worth, part of the reason that Sefra right now, part of what makes her work so essential is that I worry sometimes that like the horse is out of the barn, that everybody is going to go to their nursery grower and say, oh, I'm looking for ecotypic native plants. And the nursery grower is going to sell you something, and so that plant stick, I don't know if we have a picture of that in our presentation. I think we did somewhere. Yeah. There's a plant stick that goes to our nursery partners that has the Ecotype Project logo on it. That's one way of knowing which plants are ecotypic, or at least a part of this farming initiative. But in terms of other lists, I don't know, Sefra and Jean, do you guys have other good places for research?
Believe it or not, the Ladybird Johnson Native Wildflower Center in Texas, even though they're based in Texas, their database is searchable that will show you region. So I actually have utilized that a lot in trying to develop the protocol cards for the farmers, and that is also another pretty good database. But again, just really make sure that you're looking at the regionality that's listed. Yeah.
Another good source is Doug Tellamy has a list that I don't know if it's in his books, but it's a list of how many pollinator species are attracted to that particular plant. So if you're trying to get the most bang for your buck, that's another good list to look at as far as if you're trying to bring in as many pollinator species as you can.
And also the National Wildlife Federation has a great native plants finder, nwf.org. That's a good one.
Yeah. Let's see. There's a shout out to the Greenwich Land Trust. They are propagating native plants from seeds on their properties, which I didn't know about. There is a mention of I think a podcast on the mass decline of insects from Dr. Brian Brown. Someone asks if there are ecotypical vegetable seeds yet.
Can I just
Great
make one
question.
comment? Oh,
Nope.
can I make
Yeah,
a
go ahead.
comment on the Greenwich Land Trust is run by a wonderful, the Seed to Seed initiative they have there is run by Dan Brubaker. He's fantastic and also been a friend of the Ecotype Project. So yeah, I do encourage you all to look up that initiative. Sorry, Dina.
Ecotypic vegetable seeds is a great question. I don't know. I mean, other than the sort of wild foraged plants, like ramps, for example, are they ecotypic because they're wild to this region? I don't know. Sefra, you're better suited to the foraging question. But obviously, you know, before colonization, there was plenty of food in this region that came from this region. So I think we could probably look to some of the indigenous communities and those food lists. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think what you would want to look up from the seed saving perspective, they're called crop wild relatives, right? So when we look at where our world seed banks are placed, they're based on Nikolai Vavilov, the great botanical explorer. He mapped our world based on centers of origin. Where crops first emerge is where they have greatest centers of diversity. So maize and wheat in southern Mexico, pulses and grains in India, potatoes in Peru. And in those places, you do have those ecotypic food and forageable plants. But again, the fancy word for that is crop wild relatives. And the Crop Trust has a lot of great information and fun videos on crop wild relatives. You also would want to be thinking about land races, you know, the seeds that have persisted on the landscape since, you know, time immemorial, stewarded by the indigenous folks who are on those lands. Gary Nabhan, Nabhan, is an extraordinary author who's written a lot of really great books talking about more of the, truly local ecotypic food ways of these lands.
Somebody else, thanks, Sefra. Somebody else put a shout out to the Audubon Plant Finder, which also you can find native plants on their list as well. I think you just type in your zip code. And then someone said that there are great lists on the Pollinator Pathway website, and I would certainly urge everybody to go to the Pollinator Pathway website. They are doing an open garden weekend in June, the 25th and 26th, which I think is Pollinator Week, and the Hickories is going to be on the open garden days, as well as Nod Hill, the Aldrich, and ACT in Ridgefield, and that's throughout Connecticut. So if you go on the website for the Pollinator Pathway, there should be a map soon telling you what gardens will be open on that weekend. So that would be another way to see the Hickories.
Can I just do one more thing while we're talking about the ancestral foodways? I just have
Sure.
some fun.
Sure, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just to mention really quickly, in an effort to spread the word and spread the seeds for the Ecotype Project and for all the great work that Jean and Dina and all the Eco59 farmers have done, we started the BOATanical Expedition, because I say I'm not a botanist, I'm a botanist. And so what we do is we take these native plants and rewild them back to the living seed bank of different riparian corridors. So I've been going along the Connecticut River, which is the Algonquian word for the long tidal river. We started up in New Hampshire the first year and went to the Massachusetts border. And this past year, we did all of Connecticut, where we hike up to farms and bring new founder plots of seed to help, you know, have myrmockery, the ants help spread the seeds, and ornithockery, the birds help spread the seeds, and anthropockery, you know, humans help spread the seeds. I think oftentimes with the doom and gloom of what's going on with the climate, you know, it's too late to be pessimistic, and you realize when you plant one seed, the next year you get thousands. So the ROI of doing this work is really so encouraging. So you know, in terms of, I'm a member of the Explorers Club, and oftentimes people think they need to go to the Himalayas to go on expedition, but there's so much great work and stewardship to be done in our own backyard. So I encourage you all to grab some native plants and find some friends and get some permission and go for a paddle and help do this. So yeah, and this next year, we're going to be going up to the wild rice stands in Maine, Zizania palustris. It's not a truly native plant, but it was traded along the ancestral foodways from the Ojibwa to the native tribes that were here and have been kind of degraded by humans. And so we're going to harvest in the traditional way of dancing on it and parching it, and then replant it to make those stands prolific because they feed birds and muskrats and all sorts of fun things. So yeah, thank you for that.
Well, thank you to everybody. I don't see any more questions. This was recorded, so those of you who signed up, and if you'd like to watch it again, or if you know somebody who would like to watch it, please tune in and pick up the recording of this. Thank you again so much to the library and to Sefra and Dina and Jean and to Connecticut NOFA, the Hickories and Kautatoa and the Ridgefield Garden Club. We really appreciate your learning more about Ecotype seeds today. So thanks and take care.
Thanks so much, Kitsy. Thanks, Lucy.
Thank you. Take care.
Everyone.